Welcome to the Association of Manufacturing Excellence CEO webinar series. The Association of Manufacturing Excellence is a nonprofit organization founded in 1985, dedicated to helping companies with continuous improvement and their pursuit of operational excellence. We publish Target Magazine. We're known for running the AME International Lean Business Conference, and I'm your host, Cartier AME board member for the Western Canada region. Why CEOs fail to create continuous improvement cultures with Dr. Bob Emiliani, who's going to answer a question a lot of people struggle with, including senior executives, and one I've been trying to figure out for years. Dr. Emiliani has a 15-year industry background, including management with Pratt & Whitney during the early stages of its lean transformation efforts. For 23 years, he taught graduate and undergraduate courses in areas such as leadership, strategy, failure analysis, and the history of progressive management, and has authored or co-authored over 40 peer-reviewed papers, over 1,000 blog posts, and 28 books. His teachings have been regarded as essential and groundbreaking, phenomenal contributions, and Bob Emiliani's voice should be heard by every CEO on the planet. This is some of the feedback we received. Thank you, and welcome, Dr. Emiliani.
Thank you. It's great to be here and to be with you today and share with AME Canada some of the results of my research to try and unravel the mystery that is reflected in the title of the presentation. Let's get right to it. We ask, of course, the basic question in Lean world of what problem are we trying to solve? And so let's apply that to what I perceive Lean world to be trying to solve, the problem they're trying to solve. And the focus for many, many years, 3+ decades now, is how do we get more top business leaders and leaders of other types of organizations interested in Lean? And so the method has been to produce more and better evidence of Lean's superiority over classical management. And there's been a lot of very good work done in that area. And they've been at it a long time. But the effectiveness of that approach has been poor because we know today that there are far fewer Lean transformations than one expected 3.5 decades ago. And so the question is, why is that happening? And of course, if all we do is produce more and better evidence of Lean superiority to an audience that remains committed to classical management, then the continued effectiveness is going to be poor. And of course, in doing this, the unfortunate outcome really is to hide the problem. So we spend a lot of time and effort to produce this more and better evidence, but it fundamentally just hides the problem that needs to be solved. So I recognized this a long time ago. It was apparent by the late 90s that companies and leaders and others were struggling with this. So I set out on a research agenda, which really started to pick up steam around 2007, and then again, especially around 2015. Why are most top leaders not interested in progressive management? And I highlight as progressive management, scientific management, lean management, or Toyota's management system. These would be the early form would be progressive management would be scientific management, and as you know, the contemporary forms would be Toyota's management system and its derivative lean management. So the method that I've used is historically grounded inductive analysis, and a lot of people think research is just pie in the sky stuff and is irrelevant and not practical. But what my method of analysis was, it means that the work is rooted in real-world historical evidence. The history guides conclusions rather than starting with preconceived ideas. And starting with preconceived ideas is typical of what happens in deductive analysis. So you may know deduction from top down whereas induction is bottom up. So I've been involved with this heavily for the last 7 years, and the effectiveness is really to be determined. The focus of my work has been analysis, not prescription. I have provided some prescription in the book, The Triumph of Classical Management over Lean Management, but overall, my objective is to share with everyone the lay of the land and why answer the question shown at the bottom left, and thus make the problem visible so that people can start to think for themselves and how they can go about uh, uh, with step 2 of the problem solving, which is you know, what do you do? How do you get more leaders involved in this now that we know the lay of the land? So let's start a bit with the origin and evolution of management systems. So the traditional way of doing things, which I refer to as classical management, it has ancient origins. It goes way back in times, even as far back as ancient Egypt, ancient Mesopotamia. It is rooted in preconceptions, where preconception means a preconceived opinion or an idea formed prior to experience in the absence of reasoning. So a lot of traditions are handed down to us to this day, and we don't question them. We simply just accept them as they are. We don't reason through it if it makes sense or not, and we don't have any experience with it. And so it shows a straight purple line, but of course there's been some evolution of classical management over the thousands of years since ancient Egypt. But then if you look below that, we have the earliest form of engineering, which was military engineering, and that led to civil engineering, then mechanical, then something called industrial management, which is the work of Frederick Taylor and his colleagues. And that led to the creation of industrial engineering, which proved to be very important for the development of Toyota's production system and their overall management system. And so starting around the 1930s, Toyota's management system starts to develop, and that has been going on. Again, the straight line, you know, it's evolving. So the straight line doesn't mean it's unchanging, but it's evolving over time. And so without industrial engineering, you wouldn't have TPS. So the work of Frederick Winslow Taylor, which many people misunderstand and dislike, really is fundamental to the creation of what you love, which is called Toyota's management system. And then you see lean management that got started in the late 1980s, and that really is kind of headed off in another direction and a lot more tools orientation and things like that. So what we have showing in this diagram is a shift in industrial engineering and engineering in general over time to sensory perceptions. Progressive management, the scientific management, TPS, lean management, it's rooted in engineering and science, the scientific method, and trial and error. And trial and error is rooted in sensory perceptions. Now, the difficulty we have is that leaders tend to be far removed from the shop and office floor, so they're not sensing what's going on, those locations where people are doing the value creating work. And because of the ancient origin of classical management, it's difficult for people to adapt to the logic of progressive management. And so there are various preconceptions that form that make it really difficult for people to be able to think differently. It's very difficult for people to, you know, think differently. That leads us to Henry Gantt. And he was a famous industrial engineer in the days of Frederick Winslow Taylor. And he said the usual way of doing a thing is always the wrong way. And that includes how we have tried to so-called sell progressive management to C-level leaders. And we really haven't been reflective of that quote from Henry Gantt because we're assuming that how we're doing things is the correct way. But if we go back and look at what the scientific management community did to advance scientific management 100 years ago, we'd find we're doing basically the same way, same thing, the same way. So we've made a fundamental error in that we assumed we knew what top business leaders and other top leaders of organization wanted. We had hypotheses about their wants and needs, and they turned out to be wrong, not totally, but largely. And so some of the things that people say the leaders want is, you know, higher profits, bigger market share, and so on. And we're going to talk more about why that actually is secondary to what business leaders need. But we continue to move forward with lean without understanding the reality that our hypotheses turned out to be wrong. So we need to understand how leaders think and what's most important to them, and that's the nature of my work to get at answering the question of why do leaders not create this culture of continuous improvement. You know that in Lean World we talk about current state and future state and ideal state and so on. But basically we did not bother to understand the current state the past state, going back to ancient Egypt, but the current state of the people who lead organization. And Lean World still operates on that assumption that they do understand the current state of leadership. And that assumption's still in use today. And we're really not going to get far with Lean if you continue to hold that assumption to be true. So we find the reality of the situation is most CEOs resist, reject, or ignore progressive management, and they have since the days of Frederick Winslow Taylor and scientific management, and even in prior times for similar kinds of things. Now, that's not to say, of course, some CEOs have embraced different forms of progressive management over time. Sure, they have. But what usually happens is there's a change in ownership of the organization or a change in leadership, which then brings everything back to classical management, the old way of doing things, the traditional way of doing things. So we need to think differently about the problems that we're facing and understand that the leaders of organizations are essentially, especially for-profit businesses, they are property managers. The company is a piece of property. And these properties, of course, are bought and sold. And the property managers are charged with increasing the value of the property. And they know from experience and from the historical development of classical management and the laws that go along with it in various countries that there's a lot of ways to increase the value of the property without Toyota's management system or without Lean. So the question then becomes, okay, well, if you can increase the value of the property without Toyota's management system or Lean, then why bother with either of those? Most leaders see them as unnecessary. They have this preconception, same that economists have, that the market decides who wins, and winning is independent of the management system that a company uses. And folks should really reflect on that perspective because it's really deep and helps answer a lot of questions. Furthermore, people in the aficionados of TPS and Lean are really still to this day in the dark as to the extent and effectiveness of how tradition informs CEO decision making, what I call the CEO playbook, but also how people who come up through organizations latch on to those traditions without even knowing it. And so when they reach the highest levels, they're fully acculturated to classical management and the traditional ways of doing things, and they don't see much of a need for progressive management. One piece of tradition, of course, is mergers and acquisitions. And this, with the diagram you see here is what I term the Lean X diagram, and I created that diagram in 2018, around the time the book, The Triumph of Classical Management, was published. So that image appears in that book. And it's basically saying that, if you're a startup, there's a better need for lean management than there is if you're a large company, because as you grow, you grow through merger and acquisitions, you gain market power, and then you start to enter, oligopoly or monopoly world. And if you look at the bottom, the risk tolerance for progressive management using that is very high for startups, but very low for conservatively run large organizations. In terms of the investor's perspective, M&A is a much better indicator of future earnings than Lean. And so stock prices are based on what the company financials and what investors determine are favorable indicators for future earnings. And the investors look at Lean and say, what does that mean? How does that relate to future earnings? Now, we have a lot of examples of maybe shouldn't say a lot, but we have examples of companies like Danaher and Wiremold that everybody heralds as very successful lean transformations. But a lot of their financial results came from mergers and acquisitions. And so you would have to look for companies that did not engage in that sort of thing to really understand what the effect of lean is. And there's some companies where you can do that. I'm not sure who they are. We have to go find out. But a big part of business and what you do is grow or die. You may have heard that phrase with the company leaders say you got to grow or die. And so, again, businesses are properties. You buy them, you sell off pieces, etc. to gain the market power so that you have pricing power, because pricing power gives you higher profitability. So for the most part, while large companies are very messy in their processes and there's tons of waste and so forth, and you'd say, well, they're the perfect target for lean, for becoming lean. Yeah, that's true, but in reality, they're not such a good target after all.
Do you also see some of the lean leaders who may have started out being lean reverting back to outdated management as the organizations grow?
Yes, absolutely. And part of it is you have to fit in with your peer group. And if you're part of an executive team and you're the oddball talking about lean all the time, eventually the rest of the leadership team is going to end up flushing you out. It's very difficult for that lone person, the oddball, that what Japanese call a henjin, for them to influence the larger management team, unless of course that person happens to be the CEO, as was the case with Art Byrne at Wiremold or George Sherman at Danaher.
Is it a lack of understanding for using lean to facilitate M&A success, given from the research that I've seen, most implementations and mergers are not as successful as they are
No,
assumed they will be? Is it
that's
a lack
right.
of understanding where CEOs are not using current leadership practices to facilitate their mergers and acquisitions?
They just don't think they need to bother with that. It is true that mergers and acquisitions, mergers especially, tend to destroy shareholder value. So there's a run up in share price because some company's going to be merged or bought or whatever. And then, once you start the integration, it dips down because of the expenses associated with it and so on. And then later on, it might dip back up. But in the meantime, they're having to, harmonize departments in two different companies and computer systems and, all kinds of stuff that end up destroying shareholder value for a while. So, the conclusion would be that this is lean is better suited up for startups or companies that want to grow organically, where you have stability in the leadership team, maybe in a private-owned business world, although that's no guarantee of stability, small and medium-sized enterprises. Even then, a startup or an SME, if somebody makes an offer, if you have a small or mid-sized business and your company's worth, $300 million, let's just say $300 million, and somebody makes you an offer for 500 million, what are you going to do? You have to bring that offer to your private company shareholders, just like you would in a public company. And the shareholders will vote on it and say, yeah, bail out. That's a big bump up in money, and it's a sure thing. And I don't have to worry about you leadership team trying to grow this thing organically. Let's cash out. And then it's new owners, and they come in with usually traditional way of thinking. So even the startups and private SMEs and so forth are subject to regression. Their good lean efforts fall by the wayside. History here in 1912, Frederick Winslow Taylor, they struggled to get managers on board as well, the senior leaders of the company. They said 9/10 of our trouble has been to bring those on the management side to do their fair share of work. And invariably, they find a great deal of opposition from the senior managers, but very little opposition on the part of the workmen. And so, up until my work for over a century, nobody really understood the source of leaders' opposition to a better management system. One of those oppositions were, if we got a system that's good enough, that works, it's good enough, works well enough, and so forth, I don't need a new system. And furthermore, I really don't like systems because systems constrain me as far as what I can do as a leader and what I can't do. So if I have a system, I want one that gives me a lot of freedom to do whatever I want to do whenever I want to do it. And that's classical management. It's a much looser system compared to Toyota's management system and some of the successful so-called lean transformations. What everyone's been dealing with for decades now, and even going back to the days of scientific management, is superficial understanding of what are the causes of why CEOs don't create this culture of continuous improvement, or why they resist, reject, or ignore lean management. And so I've highlighted in red some of the things that people say, as well as in black, but fear of change, managers are not engaged, they're not properly trained, they can't let go of command and control. The problem with all of these things is you can subject them to uh, various types of root cause analysis. These are surface level understanding. These are observable through leaders' behaviors, but you have to dig down to understand why these things are what you see at the surface. And so that's what I embarked on, was 15 years and counting of research on what I call the institution of leadership and system of profound privilege. And the institution of leadership means the social habits of thought and action that is common, reflects common thinking among a particular group. And the difficulty that the lean world faces is classical management is the most favored form of organizational, of organizing and organizational control, because it maximizes leaders' status, rights, and privileges. They don't have to get involved with going to the shop floor, getting their hands dirty with stuff. It's just the antithesis of what you would expect of a so-called lean leader. And there's very little understanding or appreciation for this in lean world. So, if you don't understand the lay of the land, then the superficial reasoning and any countermeasures to try to correct the superficial understanding what the problem is will just be ineffective. So you've got to go much deeper. And that's what I did and still doing. We have some words of wisdom from Fujio Cho, who's the former president and former chairman of Toyota Motor Corporation. And he said our way of thinking is very difficult to copy or even to understand. And, it is true with the right guidance from various former Toyota consultants. Some of them are very good, some maybe not so good, depending upon the context that they're working in. But with the proper coaching, you can learn this very difficult way of thinking and understanding. But Taiichi Ono made it clear that we are doomed to failure if we do not initiate a daily destruction of our preconception, doomed to failure in creating Toyota-like management systems, which is what Lean World strives to do. And so if we don't initiate this daily destruction of our various preconceptions, then we're not going to get too far. Now, one of the hallmarks, of course, of Toyota's management system is going from batch and queue production processing, which Toyota did when it was in the Loom company and in the early days of the automotive business, to flow production and just in time. And so, one of the main preconceptions to destroy is batch and queue processing is more efficient, do the setup once and have a long run of parts off of one setup and so on and so on. And if you don't destroy those preconceptions, you're never going to achieve what's flow production or just in time. And in fact, in Lean World, there's very few who have achieved flow production and just in time. And the ones that have were typically coached by Japanese Kaizen consultant. So we need to listen to these words of wisdom because they're really important. And my view is that the folks in Lean World have essentially been listening to the wrong people for 30 plus years. Preconceptions are a problem because we're easily trapped by them. You recall that, let me find the definition here. A preconceived opinion or idea formed prior to experience and in the absence of reasoning. And these preconceptions start to hit you at a very early age. So your parents are basically your young life managers in your young life. And you're learning stuff from them at a very young age. You go to school, your teachers are your learning managers. Your doctor is your health manager. Your the sports team you're on in Little League or whatever is your sports manager. And so you're learning all about management before you even heard the word management and various aspects about management. And so these preconceptions, and I showed the variety of them here. There's 10 categories of preconceptions: economic, historical, business, political, etc. They kind of trap you so that it's very difficult to get out of this. And you have to consciously say, think to yourself, I want to destroy my preconceptions. And what preconceptions do I need to destroy? You have to ask yourself those kinds of questions. So I showed a representation here of where a person is stuck in the middle of this cube, can't really move anywhere because of their preconceptions. But in this diagram, I'm trying to show something related but different. I showed it the various categories of preconceptions. And by the way, within each category, there's 10 to 15 preconceptions. So overall, there's a lot of preconceptions, 150, maybe something like that, a little more, a little less, but about that. And I show them as a closed system of piping here, and meaning that it's just, one type of category of preconceptions reinforces the other. They're all intertwined and intermingled. And this is why when lean people go to the boss and say, hey, boss, we should do this lean stuff and it'll grow market share, improve profits, improve teamwork, develop people, that kind of story is maybe eliminating maybe 2 or 3 out of 150 preconceptions. And so the leaders are like, yeah, I don't see the reason to go do this. It's too much change and I don't understand it and so on. So lead people are trying to drill a little hole in this pipe to spring a leak and trying to find an entryway in there to change their preconceptions. But they really struggle to change the preconceptions of the senior leaders. But they really struggle to do that. So what we then have as a result of that is a continuation of the usual way of thinking, as Henry Gantt said. Business leaders, you may present the best fact-based argument for lean. And we tried to do that in the book Better Thinking, Better Results, which got into the details of the wire mold company's lean transformation, which was featured in like a 30-page vignette in the book Lean Thinking. So we ended up writing, my co-authors, a 330-page book, getting into all the detail of how wire mold's lean transformation worked. And people use that as a lean transformation model. They, bookmark the hell out of the book as their plan for change and improvement. So you can present like the book, the data, whatever, but we all as humans have preconceptions. Leaders are no exceptions. And a preconception is kind of the baseline theory of what they believe to be true without any kind of testing. Because again, these are opinions formed prior to experience and in the absence of reasoning. And then as humans, we all have cognitive biases. And preconceptions feed cognitive biases. The cognitive bias is where we fit information to our preconceptions. Again, we don't test these things because we never get anything done. We'd be busy all day testing these things. In Toyota's world, the testing is done through daily Kaizen. That's the importance of Kaizen. And Lean World forgot about Kaizen essentially starting, 25 years ago. And they moved on to value stream maps and, coaching and lean product and process development and stuff like that. That's why I showed initially it's headed off in a different direction in that slide that talked about, the origins of management systems. So what we have is when you are, wedded to archaic preconceptions and associated cognitive biases, you use that to make decisions in your thinking and predictions. And the reasoning tends to be, not always, but tends to be superficial and illogical. Certainly people are closed-minded because they don't want their preconceptions and cognitive biases messed with. They make errors in judgment, which is how companies get into trouble. And I taught a course for a few decades on going through corporate failure analyses. And things like the Boeing 737 MAX crashes are as a result of preconceptions and cognitive biases. And the result is the status quo. Classical management remains in force, unfortunately. So everybody here knows scientific thinking. Mike Rother popularized that, but it goes way back in time through trial and error in the, humans making tools, millions of years ago and so on. And of course, what the image is trying to show on the left is a hierarchy. On the left is the range of application of scientific thinking is large. It's from the workers to the president to the CEO to the board of directors. But the reality is that once you get around the middle manager level, scientific thinking kind of becomes a dead zone, and people make decisions by rights, what's called de jure, by rights, rather than by facts. And those people at the bottom of the organization, supervisors and workers, they have to live by the facts. When the machine breaks, they just can't say it was, God's will and we'll wait for some, intervention to fix it. They have to go understand the facts of why the machine broke, why the quality of the part was problematic, why the output was below what's required, why things don't fit together once you start to assemble things. They have to live in a fact-based world. They cannot live, and that's called de facto world, the facts, the fact-based world. They can't live in this dead zone of where there's no scientific thinking, and instead just sit in a conference room and chat about what they think the problem is without ever going to the source. Now, this is not to say that it's completely dead zone all the time. Yes, leaders look at data and so forth, but we also know that leaders tend to like to have their biases confirmed. So when you go to a leader and say, but your thinking is wrong and the data shows this and your decision that you're about to make is wrong, they usually don't look favorable upon that. So this is another way of expressing what's going on. At the bottom of the organization, you have the worker, the supervisor, and the mid-level manager, but principally the worker and supervisor. These people are faced with technical problems of various types. It could be, in an insurance business, it's not always manufacturing, but whatever technical problem. They have to do some they're running the process, and they have to, they're running the processes throughout the company. And they have to utilize some kind of scientific problem-solving method to solve problems, to run the processes, so the processes run and produce what's required. And the people above the middle manager are focused on running the business. And they solve business problems de jure by right. And how do they solve problems? Principally by social problem solving. A lot of copying of what other leaders do. And they also like to delegate things to people at lower level, basically say, you do this. I'm not going to do it, but, tasking you to go doing this. And they delegate, of course, lean to other people because they're busy, in their minds, they're busy running the business, and that's separate from running the process, and the two shall not commingle. And of course, we all know with Toyota's management system that the two do commingle. And so anyway, now another way of expressing the business technical divide. So this is the third way that I want to show it to you. You have at the top the Genba. I put the Genba at the top because that's where value is created. People are doing things there that result in people paying money for whatever the company or organization produces. So at the Genba, that's workers' reality. That's based on sensory perception. They're doing things with their sight and touch and sound and so on. And that is the truth of what is going on there is the truth of the reality of the situation, and they have the know-how to run the process. And so what I show here is a Ethernet cable. This is a computer system that is very elaborate in companies nowadays to transform the reality of the Genba into metaphysical representation. So what is a metaphysical representation? Metaphysical means external to human sensory perception. So that is money. I mean, how do you know money is worth anything? Just it has a number on it, so that's it, but you really don't know anything more than that. KPIs, spreadsheets, dashboards. And so what are executives looking at? Spreadsheets and dashboards and things like that. This is not the Genba. This is not reality. It is a representation of reality. And oftentimes not a very good representation of reality because the leaders don't tell, the workers don't tell the leaders what's really going on because they'll get blamed. Anyway, sakaku is a Japanese word for illusion of reality or illusion. And so leaders have an illusion of reality through this transformation of the real world, the truth, the Genba, to some computer screen. So this is external to sensory perception. They interpret this information, they make predictions, and they make decisions. A lot of times those decisions hurt the Gemba. They're doing things like, we got to lay off people or, do other things because they think they're not cost competitive, but that's because they don't know what's going on at the Gemba. So the D in the circle with the arrow on the left, the leaders, it means decision making. The leaders firmly believe that the metaphysical representation, the spreadsheets and dashboards, equals reality. But there is no way that that's true. The metaphysical representation is always less than reality. And that, of course, opens up a huge pathway for errors in leadership decision-making. And of course, the leaders just walk right into that every time in classical management. So the next thing to consider is how the in-group retards advancement of classical management. So the in-group here is, classical management. The social in-group is the people who favor classical management. And they accept the preconceptions and cognitive biases associated with classical management. The cognitive biases, things are like overconfidence, anchoring, confirmation bias, status quo. They accept the preconceptions and cognitive biases because that helps them overcome the facts of what's really going on the Gemba. And when you go to the classical management CEO and say, we want to do this lean stuff, or other people throughout the hierarchy, they'll mount a defense. And they'll say lean takes too long. I heard it over at some other place and it didn't work there. It doesn't apply to knowledge work, in the purchasing and in the IT and HR and whatever. Of course, we're different. Everybody's heard that. Batch processing is more economical. I've seen it. I can do the calculation myself. There's no way, any way of doing things is cheaper than that. And so basically, this is a hostile response. And they're doing that to affirm their in-group identity and denigrate the out-group. And basically say to the out-group, you don't know what you're talking about. You're wrong. They're gaslighting you. You're dreaming, etc. Then we have the social out-group, which is much smaller. It's this little world of people who are aficionados of Toyota's management system and lean management. And what those people in the social out-group like to do is something very different. They like to destroy preconceptions, the economic, social, political, all those categories where you saw the tubing. And they like to understand the facts of what's going on to overcome their cognitive biases. So it's a hugely different world that we're dealing with here, and it's no surprise that it's a tough sell to leaders, or it should be no surprise. Now, unfortunately, as I showed you in the first slide, is that what problem are we trying to solve? Lean world is still trying to produce more and better evidence of lean superiority over classical management. So at this point, I think you can see that that's just plain idiotic to keep doing that. There's been 37 years of books written and articles and videos and Planet Lean, if you subscribe to that, a lot of bloggers and blah, 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 endless amount of this stuff. And then, of course, everybody in some in public, but a lot of people in private are saying, this isn't working out as planned. What do we do? Well, what do you do when you're stuck? You do so, get more information. And I've provided that to people. It's there now. All you got to do is read it and get together and think of some countermeasures. So over the history of modern progressive management, it turns out that progressive management is everything most leaders do not want. It challenges their status, rights, privileges, and protections. They don't see it as a differentiator in how the management system would improve company performance compared to things like M&A. They don't see it as an improvement in management practice or leadership practice. They view it as corrupting classical management, which works, just fine, good enough. It's not perfect, it's got problems. And the classical management in-group can make the case that the world has come a long way, as a result of classical management. It's lifted a lot of people out of poverty and so on and so on. And so, don't bite the hand that feeds you. It's been good. They can make that case legitimately. You might not like it. They also, by the way, another thing is most leaders aren't interested in developing people beyond what is necessary to do the job. Their preconception is training is an expense, it's time away from work, etc. You and I know that that's, from Toyota and Lean World, that that's not the case, but that's the preconceptions you're dealing with. And until you recognize those preconceptions, you're not going to get very far. So let's look at some of those preconceptions for classical management. Humans have limitations. Support and defend the status quo, respect tradition. Trial and error is not a plan. Continuous change destabilizes. Avoid abstract schemes. I'm reading from the left-hand side. If it works, don't experiment. Scientific thinking is hazardous. Logic is slow and laborious. All those things run counter to experimentation, Kaizen. If you're a fan of Toyota Kata, it all runs against that. Look on the right-hand side. Imagination disappoints. Chihiro Nakao is saying, if you can dream it, you can do it. In classical management, they want to kill the dreaming. Just go do it. Forget about the dreaming. Alternatives are worse. Things cannot be perfected. Whatever is right. And in Lean World, whatever is wrong. They like conflict and competition. They like conquest. Mergers and acquisition are an extension of, beating people in a nearby village, and then taking all their food and treasure and so forth. It's a form of meritorious activity, being the winner like that. There must be hierarchical control. You should revere institutions. So, this gives you a sense of the preconceptions that are going on here that most Lean people just are completely unaware of. So, as a result of all that, Lean is nearly always diluted. If you look at the bottom, you see Toyota's management system, the business impact is high. The genetic similarity to classical management is very low. But as Lean gets diluted and into the just, tools type of category, you have Lean Light, Lean Ultra Light. There's very little impact or no impact, and it looks a lot like classical management with some tools added to the classical management toolkit. So a lot of what Lean has achieved after 37 years is simply improving the efficiency of classical management, not making really any headway with Lean management in these organizations. And that's a real shame. But again, people were not working on the kind of problems that I've been working on. And so, this is the expected outcome. You may be familiar with Deming and his system of profound knowledge, which is something that he developed very late in his career. He was mainly a statistician, but he had enough interaction with companies to know that they had some problems, as well as interaction with Japanese companies to recognize things that they did better. And so I created the opposite of that, the system of profound privilege, and that's some of which I have been describing here. The problem is, of course, the system of profound privilege beats the system of profound knowledge just about every time. And the rate at which classical management thinking and the system of profound privilege develops. If you just think about how many people are in the system today as managers and soon to be CEOs in classically managed businesses, the rate at which they are being developed vastly outnumbers the rate at which Lean people are coming up through the system to become Lean leaders. So you kind of have this population problem of the social in-group is growing at a much faster rate than the out-group. And this is, again, something Lean is not interested in addressing. So if you look at the right-hand side, this is Deming's system of profound knowledge. You have humans and their life processes. So you have natural senses and natural abilities that humans have. They are evolving in how they think and do things and so forth in ever-changing human-oriented systems. they're curious, they're thinking, they're experimenting, they're gaining all this practical learning, and that results in progress. And this framework is built from sensory perceptions. On the other side of it, you have system of profound privilege. Here you have the deities, the creators of our universe and so forth, of our world. And the monarchs, kings and queens, divine right of kings and queens and so forth, that they descend from the deities. You have natural rights and natural law and the founding legal documents and so forth. And the monarchs give the privilege give certain privileges to high-ranking people to conduct business and to political leaders, and the business and political leaders interact, and they have a vested interest to maintain the status quo. So you can see this vast difference here between what Deming's proposing as the system of profound knowledge and what exists today in classical management with the institution of leadership and system of profound privilege. The result of that is certain, hard truths that we'd rather ignore, but that are there. And you may have interacted with, if you have worked in a big company in particular, the things in yellow here when you interact with vice presidents, executive vice presidents, president, CEO, whatever, the way of thinking, you rarely see them at the place where the workers work. They're in their offices, maybe they're hundreds of miles away in the corporate office from where the work is happening. But if you do need to interact with a worker, don't go to them, make them come to you. You may have seen leaders do some kind of all hands meeting or some meeting in an auditorium and so forth, or even one-on-one meeting or small groups. The rule is for them, listen attentively to workers, but ignore what they have to say. So they come to these types of meetings, but do they bring a pen and a paper to write anything down? Any action items? Are they documenting any of these improvement opportunities? And oftentimes the answer is no. Respecting workers and their work shows weakness. Don't do it. Again, this is the type of mentality that goes with classical management, to greater or lesser extents. I'm not saying everybody thinks exactly the same way in the classical management world, but to greater or lesser extents, it's kind of like this. And you'll always find the anomaly in classical management world. There's some good managers there that don't think this way. Never let facts impede your decision making. Create disturbances to keep workers on edge. Fear is your greatest power. Be generous with it. Always blame workers or someone else for your failures. Progress must never exceed the status quo by more than a tiny increment. Learn from other leaders, but ignore the outliers. Big history of that. In fact, Toyota is considered an outlier by most CEOs. Ignore them. We got nothing to learn from them. Never accept responsibility, even if convicted. So, it's tough way to think, tough way to overcome this thinking. Kings and queens 500 years ago were, of course, business leaders. And the dress is different today, but many of you will be familiar with the royal attitude, the mindset, the sentiments, and so forth that remain largely the same then as now. And I want you to realize that it's just 17 generations back to 1500. So you got to believe that the way we think in terms of business leadership and other things then is still with us today. And even if you go back to ancient Egypt, 5,000 years ago seems like a long, long time, but it's only 170 generations ago. So we still think like people in ancient Egypt. This diagram I adapted it from Michael Porter's Five Forces framework, which he developed in 1979. And what it's showing at the center is leaders' metaphysical realm, the institution of leadership, their social habits of thought and action, like a closed system there. There's status quo, there's stagnation, there's waste, there's lag, there's regression, and so on. And then outside of that, you have the workers who, given the freedom, are progressive. They want to experiment and try things. If they don't get shut down by the bosses, they want to evolve how they do things. Many of you know this from your own hobbies at home. The first way you did some particular type of work is not the way you do it today, because you have evolved and improved the work to make it higher quality, less difficult. It used to take you 10 hours to, 100 hours to build the ship in the bottle or whatever, and now it takes you just 2 hours. So this is the productive and evolutionary material realm that workers are in. But to leaders, this often to them, not always, but looks, process improvement is a threat. The efficiency, improved efficiency is a threat. Creativity, you go to the boss, say, let's try it this way, and you get shut down, and they say, just do your job. And the threat of social change. And essentially, leaders, one of the reasons why you have a hierarchy is to get permission from all of these levels to improve the process efficiency, et cetera, which basically says they want to be the drivers of this stuff and have the right of refusal to say, no, we're not doing that. We're not spending money on that equipment. We're not going to do those ideas. And they have really low interest in the social changes that people in lean world want. That the developing people, respect for people, empowering people, all that kind of stuff is not of significant interest to leaders of organizations. So, the traditions are problematic. Preconceptions are highly problematic. These are insensitive to something better. People would rather stick with the devil you know, you've heard that aphorism, than change to something better. The worldview of most top business leaders is metaphysical. I represent this with money, but it's other things that other than money that is metaphysical, that determines their approach to recognizing problems and their approach to solving problems. Whereas Toyota leaders, they have a material view of the work. They have a material view of the world, and that results in a very different approach to recognizing and solving problems. Now, Toyota leaders, of course, have to understand the metaphysical world view as well, because they have to deal with numbers and spreadsheets and KPIs. But as everyone knows, their perspective is deeply rooted in the material world and how the work is performed and so forth, which to some extent Lean has lost touch of, because the industrial engineering methods that are practiced in Kaizen are not talked about much anymore within Lean world. So in my research, what I have found is the roots of CEOs' disinterest in TPS and Lean relate to preconceptions, social aspects, spiritual, corporate finance, cognitive, aesthetic, workmanship, a whole bunch of things. It's not just linear causality that leaders fear change, end of story, or, leaders aren't engaged. It's not that. What you see on the right, again, are some of the typical things that people attribute at the surface level, what they observe, why leaders don't go for Lean. And Lean World's really got to get smarter and stop citing these things, because they offer zero pathway to effective countermeasures. I mean, if you're if you're at the level of arithmetic, you're not going to be able to deal with differential equations ever if you stop at arithmetic. And that's basically what we have here, that this is arithmetic stuff, and people just need to progress in their understanding of what's going on, the lay of the land. So I'll pose this to the viewers, knowing all this, what should you do? Are you going to say, wow, this is overwhelming, I don't know, I'm going to give up, I'm going to leave Lean, I'm going to join the finance organization, and I'm going to become an accountant because there's always work there. I'll never get laid off, and so on. You're going to do nothing? Or are you going to think of new ideas and try them out? Think of countermeasures. Are you going to study the work that I've done? Are you going to gain more knowledge so that you can think of new ideas to try? What are you going to do? So I will leave you with that.
Yeah, one of the questions that I have that this speaks to is, as a CEO who's recognizing that they have preconceptions, perhaps for the first time, what steps do do you think they can take to start to address that and not fall into the status quo in traditional management situation?
So they're going to first have to, start to understand what are preconceptions and start to think about in business. There's going to be preconceptions related to the general category of business, and there's going to be economics and things like that. And they're going to have to start to unravel their own mystery. Now, I've done some of that, to the extent that they're willing to go read and not view reading a book as theory. That, I mean, the books I write, most of them are thin. There's a book called The Changed Perspective, which walks the leaders through these various types of preconception, that they can start to understand how their thinking is rooted in something that no longer fits the times. And in fact, classical management should have gone away in the post World War II period, after World War II was over. But instead, because we did a lot of lean type stuff in World War II, there was flow production and the production of material for the war, airplanes, bullets, whatever, tanks. You had flow production lines, and then the war's over and people go back to batch and queue. So we are 75 years, 80 years behind where we need to be in terms of what is needed today. Most markets are, despite company leaders' efforts to create monopolies and oligopolies to get pricing power. Basically, I want to avoid competition, is what they're saying, because competition is too hard. I want to avoid that. And so that's why they proceed with oligopolies and monopolies and things like that. But even despite that, we still have, even though markets are consolidated, we still have buyers markets for a lot of things, like automobiles. There's a number of automobile producers. There's a number of different price points for automobiles and so forth. It's a buyer's market. And Toyota's management system was developed for buyer's markets specifically. Scientific management was developed for seller's market because back in the late 1800s and early 1900s, companies could sell more than they could produce. And the companies were not producing enough to get the sales. So Frederick Taylor and scientific management was designed as a way to improve productivity so you could meet market demand. Whereas Toyota's system was, we're not going to make something unless somebody orders it. And then we'll figure out how to make it, make on demand, more or less. So anyway, did I answer your question?
Yeah, I just one more here. From the perspective of a board of directors or a private equity or an owner who has a company or companies and needs their CEOs to operate in the year that we live in, what suggestions may you have for them to be both, paying attention to what can they put into place to address this? How can they provide accountability for that CEO to fulfill their role?
A difficult question. I mean, like boards of directors, there's a large in group of classical management. You have to really want, some people end up saying that, this just isn't working anymore. I got to look outside what I know to find better ways of doing things. But a lot of people are just really happy with the way things are, and they'll rationalize it as, as imperfect as it is, it works, it's good enough. But there are some people who just say, every day work is too hard, too stressful. I'm talking about people higher up.
Yeah.
Too many problems come to my attention. People don't know how to solve problems at lower levels. For some people, there's just a boil over on this sort of thing. And they're like, I got to look for something different. And they, discover lean. But they're not going to get too far if the discovery is just a bunch of lean tools.
Okay.
They have to want more. They have to look for more. I mean, fundamentally, you're trying to go from batch and queue production, where you have quality problems, long lead times, a lot of expensive work in process and so forth, to flow production, better quality, shorter lead time, less work in process. Good for the customer, good for your company.
Okay. Yeah, and that applies whether it's software or healthcare or government. It's
Any
all
of it,
that.
all that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I see we're right on time. So thank you very much for your insights, Bob, and we'll follow up in the future.
Yeah, I hope so. Okay, great. I enjoyed it. Thank you for inviting me. I appreciate it.
For more AME events on the ame.org website, you can see our upcoming AME webinars. Our next webinar is the Strategy Execution Blueprint, covering how to align strategy, operations, and continuous improvement using Hosh and Conry. That will be on August 14th. Our popular 2-second lean series has its next event on August 20th. And you can find information on the International Lean Business Conference in October. Senior management may also be interested in our previous webinar, How to Build Your Next Manufacturing Facility. And I do plan on having Dr. Bob Emiliani back for a future webinar. If you're a Canadian CEO or senior executive, we'd love to hear what business problem you're struggling with. So you can email us at canadaregion@ame.org. I'll put that in the chat. The intent here is to produce more content for the CEO presentations.